So I take great pride in introducing you to Erica Helson.
Thanks, Mr. Burns. Good morning. Thanks for having me. So as Mr. Bunce mentioned, I graduated in 2004 from Villanova. So just spare you the math, that was about 20 years ago. So I'll talk to you about what I've been up to since then. Um, I grew up here in Ojai, and I moved back to Ojai in 2019. I never thought I would come back to Ojai, but I don't know, around that time it started to sound like a nice place to live again. And I was gone for about 15 years. I went to Pitzer, which is one of the Claremont colleges, so not too far away. I studied political science there. And then I moved to Los Angeles, lived there for about 5 years, and then I was in New York City for about 6 years. Um, and the reason I'm here is I understand that there's some interest in green jobs and sustainability. It's a topic that at least some of you are interested in. So I want to share with you how I ended up working in this field. And I think when you hear career advice, I think you're often told, like, follow your passion. Maybe that's something that you've heard. And I think that that is ultimately what I've done, is I've with my passion for the environment and worked in this space. But it took me a while to find that passion. Dog on the loose. Um, so I'll share just a little bit about like how it is that I ended up where I am today, because when I was your age, I definitely didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or that this is where I would end up. Um, so when I was at Villanova, I started what we called the Ecology Club, and we basically just did recycling. And to be honest, I'm not sure if anyone even took the recycling and put it in the recycling bin, but we had boxes and people put their paper in there, and that was basically all we did. It sounds like you have an environmental club here today. Are any of you in that club? A few? Cool. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing now, hopefully more than just some recycling. Um, But yeah, I always was interested in environmental issues. I think growing up in Ojai, you have so much access to nature. I mean, even just this campus here, like growing up in a city, there are lots of kids who never have any exposure to nature. But I think growing up in Ojai, you are just turned into an environmentalist through that exposure. Can you hear me? Can anyone hear me over this truck? Can you hear me okay though? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thanks. No, that's okay. Um, let's see. So where was I? Yeah, basically I was just saying, like, I think growing up here in Ojai and having all this exposure to nature turned me into an environmentalist. So in school, I started this ecology club. We picked up some paper, we tried to recycle it, but it was kind of just a hobby for me. But the way that my career path went was I studied political science at Pitzer. I was always kind of interested in like government. Maybe I thought I'd move to Washington, D.C., work in politics. Um, I was interested in the idea of the power of government to, change policy and improve the world. Um, so that's what I thought I would do. But when I was at my first year at Pitzer, I did not like college that much. I was pretty excited about leaving Ojai and going to school, but I didn't love college immediately. So I thought, how do I get out of here but kind of still stay on this path? So I decided to study abroad my first semester of my sophomore year. And usually you kind of wait till like junior year to do study abroad, but there was a program in environmental studies studying restoration ecology in Costa Rica. So I thought that sounded pretty cool. I'll go to Costa Rica first semester. And we worked on this land that was a cattle ranch, and our project was basically to help restore it to its natural state and bring back all the biodiversity. So that was pretty cool too. And I was interested in, again, environmental issues, but it was just kind of a side interest. I ended up doing a minor in environmental studies, but I continued on my political studies path. And when I was graduating, I still didn't know what I wanted to do. But I had heard of AmeriCorps. Have any of you heard of AmeriCorps? No? Okay. So AmeriCorps it's a government program, and it's basically where you do a year of service and you get paid not very well, but the idea is you do a year of service to your country, and in exchange you get a little bit of an education award. And I had a lot of student loans, so that sounded like a good opportunity. So I did AmeriCorps with the American Red Cross. So I spent a year working for the Red Cross. My job was teaching CPR and first aid, and we did like puppet shows for kids, teaching them about earthquake safety. So it was an interesting job, and I got my education award, and I stayed involved with the AmeriCorps organization, but I wasn't super passionate about that work. I thought it was interesting, but I didn't love it. But I was always kind of reading articles about solar energy and climate change and trying to understand these issues. Um, so I decided, after I worked for the American Red Cross for about 4 years, um, and again, I gained a lot of good experience there, but it just wasn't, I didn't feel super passionate about it. So I decided it was time for a career change and I should follow this interest. Um, so I would say, if you also are trying to explore what your passion is, or you just feel like, I'm interested in some things, but I don't know what I should pursue, pay attention to what are you looking at in your free time and what excites you. And that's what helped me find my path into solar energy. So I thought, okay, climate change feels like a pretty big issue. How do we solve that issue? Well, we have to change the energy that we're using to clean energy. So maybe I could find a job at a solar company. So I just emailed like maybe 10 solar companies out of the blue and just said, here's who I am. I'm looking for a job. And one of them responded to me. And that's how I got my start working in the sustainability sector. So I worked for this solar company for about 1 year and learned all about the solar industry. And part of what I learned is that it's really like policy that changes the adoption of solar. So there are some states like California where we have lots of solar energy, and there are other states where they have hardly any solar energy. And it's not because of like the amount of sunshine that they get, it's because of the policies that are in place. So it's about, how do you economically incentivize solar? So in California, we've done a pretty good job of it, although we've had some recent policy changes that were kind of taking a step backwards, which I can talk more about if people are interested. But that job, working for that solar company for the first year, got me really interested in working on policy. So I decided, I'm going to go to graduate school. I'm going to learn about environmental policy, then I'm going to work on solar energy policy. And so I had about 4 or 5 years in between undergraduate and graduate school. I never really intended to go to grad school, but at that point it felt like there's something that I know I want to study. So some more unsolicited advice for all of you. Personally, for me, I thought that was really helpful, like having a few years to work in the real world before deciding whether or not I wanted to go to grad school. So I went to grad school at Columbia in New York, and I studied environmental science and policy. And then when I graduated, I got a job doing some environmental consulting work, learning about energy use in big buildings in New York City. And then I did start working on a job where I worked on solar policy. And what I did was, all right, so when you have a solar, does anyone have solar at their home? Okay.
Yeah.
And do you know, when the power goes out, your solar might not continue to work unless you have a battery backup system hooked up to it.
Yes, I get that.
So there's this whole issue with, when the power goes out, if your solar is still running, it can send power back into the electric lines. And when crews are working on the lines, then that's dangerous for them. So solar is basically designed to shut off when the power goes out, unless you have this special configuration with a battery. So the job that I worked on was figuring out, how do we have more solar that can stay online when the power goes out? We need these resiliency benefits, so how do we get that? And I was in that role, I'd say, for maybe 3 years. And we passed some policies in New York City, setting some goals for battery storage. but I was a little frustrated with how slow policy moves. So I think policy is really impactful. Let's say we have a policy to set a goal for 50% of our homes being powered by renewable energy. Once you pass that policy, it can have a really big impact, but it can take years or decades sometimes to pass these policies. And I was a little too impatient for that. I kind of missed the days of working for the solar company, where we just got to put solar on the roof and there was like a lot of immediate gratification in installing that solar right away. Um, Mr. Bunce, can you also help me, like, let me know when I'm getting close to my 20 minutes? Okay. Um, so I worked for this policy role, but again, I got a little frustrated with policy. It was just like moving too slowly. So then I went to work for New York City government for an economic development agency. And our job was to help grow green jobs. So economic development agencies, basically, they're thinking about how do we keep the economy strong? How do we make sure that we have jobs for people? And if we have to create jobs, like what kind of jobs do we want in our city? And we decided that we wanted green jobs. So what I did was I studied all these different sectors. I studied offshore wind, I studied the solar energy sector, energy efficiency, and we looked at where are the job opportunities. And a lot of the opportunities are in construction, design and architecture, engineering. Um, People, often talk about green jobs, but like, what does that actually mean? And a lot of these jobs are construction jobs. It is the people who are installing electric panels, so electricians. It's the people who are installing the solar panels, but it's also people who are doing things like insulation and water heaters and stuff that might sound kind of boring, but when you think about where do all of our emissions come from, like if you're concerned about climate change and you want to reduce your emissions, part of what you need to think about is your water heater. Is it powered by gas? Then it's creating emissions. And there are electric water heaters, and the people who install those water heaters, they're doing the green jobs. Um, so that job, I learned a ton. I got to do lots of networking. I met lots of people, but I was interested in coming back to California to be closer to my family. So at that point, I looked into what kind of jobs were available in Ventura County. Um, I'll also mention I am doing the public loan forgiveness program. So some of you might have heard this. If you have to take on loans for school, which I did, I have tons of student loans. If you work in the public sector or for certain nonprofits, then your loans can get forgiven after 10 years. So I had already done several years of working for the public sector. So when I was moving back to California, I thought, okay, I want to work in sustainability and I want to work in the public sector because I want to get these loans forgiven. Um, so I found a job at the County of Ventura on the sustainability team. So what I do now, I work on the Tri-County Regional Energy Network, and what we do is we run programs to help with the energy transition that we're going through. So right now, there's a big kind of invisible transition happening with all of our buildings where our buildings, at least in California, they're mostly powered by electricity, like the light bulbs, the air conditioning, that's powered by electricity. And then usually our heaters, our water heaters, and our stoves, those are usually powered by gas. So we know that if we're burning gas, we're generating emissions. And if we want to tackle climate change, we got to get rid of our emissions. So we need to get rid of the gas from our buildings. So a lot of what I do is work on programs that help people swap out their equipment. So we have incentives. We give people money to try and make the electric equipment cheaper than the gas equipment. And then at the same time, across the state, we're developing more and more renewable energy. We're building these big solar power plants. We're putting more solar on our roofs. We're developing offshore wind. We're developing onshore wind. So the more green we can get our grid, then all this electricity we're using in our buildings, then that can be clean energy. There's still some natural gas power plants in California, but we're working to replace those with renewable energy and with battery storage. Um, We train contractors, we train architects, we help them understand what is a green building, how do you design a green building, how do you make a green building, um, so that we can, again, gradually phase out all of our emissions from our buildings. And when you think about where our emissions come from, buildings are a big chunk, but transportation is a big part of it too, right? All of our cars, a lot of them are using gas. So at the county, we also have programs on electric vehicles. So educating people about what kind of incentives there are so that your electric vehicle can be more affordable, or just any questions that people have, like, am I going to be stranded on the side of the road if I have an electric vehicle? We have an EV coach, and that's someone who helps answer questions about electric vehicles. And then another thing that the county does, the county sustainability division, is we have a climate action plan for the county. So we're thinking about all the different ways that the county needs to address climate change and making a plan for each one of those things. So we're looking at our buildings, we're looking at transportation, we're looking at agriculture and this idea of regenerative agriculture, and we have policies in place for all of these different ways that we can help tackle climate change. How much time do I have? Okay. All right, so that's a little bit about kind of my career path and how I ended up where I am. So I guess just a theme to reiterate is that I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I didn't go into college with a major declared. That took some time. Even by the time I graduated college, I hadn't decided that sustainability was like a big interest of mine. So that definitely took some time for me to find that passion. But I feel like working in this space has been really great. It's a good time. There's lots of different types of jobs. So if you're interested in sustainability, I work on energy, but some people work on water conservation. Some people work on waste management, and they're very interested in compost and this idea of the circular economy, which is, the idea of rather than using materials that just get thrown away after we use products, how do we use materials that can be brought back into the cycle and are more sustainable? You can work on air quality, water quality. There's lots of different ways to protect the planet if that's what you're interested in. And I think it's a really great field. I've met tons of friends working in this space. I feel like you end up working with like-minded people. So it's been a really great way to meet friends and spend your days with people who share your interests. And then the other thing I wanted to share was just a little bit about working in public sector, private sector, or nonprofit. I never really gave it too much thought when I was a student, but I think there's pros and cons to each. When I worked in the private sector, I noticed this was for the solar company. It was really small. There were about 5 of us, and we worked out of this guy's house in Santa Monica. And the company was like really nimble because it was private sector, and we could, basically make our own rules. Whereas now in government, there's tons of rules we have to follow. And it was really fun working for that solar company. My boss was kind of a political activist. He was a journalist on the side. When Obama was running for office, we went and campaigned for him as part of our job. Working in the government, we stay very neutral on politics, and that's a difference, and that's fine. And I have enjoyed working in government as well, but when I worked in the private sector, it felt very flexible. If we had an idea, we could go pursue it. And then working in government, what I like about government is that there is a lot of potential for impact. And yes, there's lots of rules you have to follow, but there's a lot of benefits too. So, for example, running an incentive program. So let's say that we feel like we want to get rid of gas in Ojai, and we want to get rid of all of our gas water heaters. So we're going to create an incentive program to make electric water heaters cheaper. You can't do that with the private sector. Running an incentive program, there's just not the funds to do it. But when you have the power of government and the resources of government, you can do things that have a really big impact. There's also a lot of stability in my role in government. There's good benefits. We're kind of we're not worried always about like bringing in our profit margin like we were in the private sector. And then same for the nonprofit sector as well. There was always fundraising that happened in that space, so it feels like there's more stability in government. Um, in the nonprofit sector, I would say I enjoyed my time in the nonprofit sector because, again, you can really do work that you're passionate about for whatever kind of cause that you have, whether it's animals or the environment, what have you. There's probably a nonprofit that's focused on that issue. And so it was really nice to be able to work in the nonprofit sector and learn how those work as well. And I really enjoyed having the opportunity to work in all these different spaces. You know, I didn't just set off on my government path and work there for my entire career. I think it was nice to just experience all the differences and see what feels good for you. I think when I was working on my green jobs role in New York City, a lot of what we did was help startups. So we were able to see, you know, these people, entrepreneurs who had ideas, wanted to start a business. And as government, we used the power of government to help invest in those companies. And seeing all of the innovation that happened in the startup space was really exciting too. So my 2 cents is just that there are lots of pros and cons. Public sector, private sector, they're all very different, and I think it's worth exploring all of them to see what feels right for you. Um, all right, those are kind of the main points I want to make, but I'd love to hear any questions you all have.
What was your experience like at Pitzer?
Okay, what was my experience at Pitzer? Um, so, like I said, my first year, I really didn't like Pitzer at all, actually. I grew to love it, but my first year, I think the transition to college for me just, I was really excited to leave Ojai. I don't know how you all feel like I love Ojai now, but as a student, I just felt kind of bored. I didn't know how good I had it. So I was really excited to leave Ojai and go to college. And then once I was there, I don't know, I think that I'm a little more introverted and it took me a while to make good friends. So it just felt kind of lonely. And so I didn't like it. And that's why I decided to study abroad. But then when I came back, I just was more adjusted and I really liked how small Pitzer was. So I looked at going to some of the UC campuses. And after being in a school like Villanova, I went to Mitilaha, so I had gone to like a bigger school before, but I really loved how small Pitzer was because you get to know everyone. You get to know your professors really well. The professors had us into their homes. And I loved that Pitzer was so focused on environmental issues. So of all the five Claremont colleges, Pitzer tends to be the most environmentally focused. And there was a piece of land that the school owned that they hadn't decided what they were going to do with yet. So in the meantime, they just kind of let it be like this natural space, and it was a biological field station. And there was a student club that formed to kind of protect this land because it was really cool to have, yes, your campuses and your classrooms, but also this like natural biological field station classroom. There were lots of great student groups. Yeah, I ultimately enjoyed Pitzer, but yeah, it was a little bit of a rocky adjustment for me.
Thank you. Another question? I know you discussed like how emissions are bad for the environment, but would you also just like be able to discuss how like disposing of these batteries can also be like maybe harmful for the environment because they're kind of like hard to dispose of, I guess you could say.
Yeah, there's lots of controversy around batteries for sure. Um, so I think the way I would explain that is so we know that climate change is happening. We have all these greenhouse gas emissions that are causing warming, and not just warming, but change, right? And then the way to address that is clean energy. And then because when the sun is not shining, when the wind isn't blowing, we still need energy. So then the solution there is batteries. But you're totally correct that there are lots of issues with batteries too. Like they're not just this savior for the environment. Mining of the materials creates a lot of environmental issues. There are human rights issues around the mining that's happening. So I think we are working towards addressing those issues and trying to make the mining and production of these materials safer for the planet and for the people. But if you look at the alternatives, if we are not going to use batteries and just continue generating emissions, building coal power plants, building natural gas power plants, the environmental consequences of that are greater than if we don't solve climate change. So I think the way the environmental movement is looking at batteries is we know we need to do better in that space, but it's almost like just a necessary evil or a necessary growing pain that we have to get through. And the other thing is that, like, yes, we use batteries for energy, but also we use batteries for so many things. We've been using batteries for decades and decades. Batteries aren't new. It's just that the scale that we're using them at now is new. Using them in cars, using them in homes, using them in these big utility scale battery power plants. We're just using more of them. And I think something that I've learned a lot about in this space is technology adoption. So we're using new technologies, and how do those come into our society, and how do we get better at creating them and recycling them? And so with batteries, I think we're just going through a lot of growing pains to figure out how do we do better.
I have another question over here.
So I appreciate your question, Liv, on Pitzer College. So I'm the college and career counselor here, and I have some questions about colleges. I know that the kids are hearing about Pitzer and Columbia, but I also know that at our local community college at Ventura College, we have a really great construction management program and a water science program, and I know you talked about those aspects. Can you talk about the pathway from those programs to maybe a job in the government? And I know the kids are always curious about how well that could pay and the time frame leading to that.
Yeah, good question. Yes, I went for these like fancy schools that were very expensive, and then I have tons of student loans, and that has limited some of my choices. And I think in hindsight, maybe I would have done it the same. I don't know. Can't go back and undo it, so I won't speculate too much on that. But yeah, I definitely took on a lot of student loans. And so, like, for example, I said, I was trying to find this government job because I kind of needed the government job to forgive my loans. Now what I do at the county, I work on this program where we have a workforce development program, training, focused a lot on the trades, construction jobs. And I see that there's way less education, like they didn't spend as many years in school as I did. They didn't take on all the loans that I took on. And then they're going on to run their own businesses and make really good livings. So I think that there's, a lot of good opportunity in construction. The way construction has been run, like there hasn't been a lot of innovation in construction. Contractors are not required to go back and do continuing education and kind of learn about like what is the latest in green building. But what we're seeing is there's lots of young contractors who are making their names as green builders, and they're doing things like getting, there's a certification called Passive House. It's a type of green building. Becoming a Passive House green builder. Through the program I work on at the county, we offer free Passive House certification. There's lots of programs now to try and convert contractors to be more focused on green building. So we partner with some of the colleges. We partner with the Career Technical Education Program in Oxnard. They have a green skills program. And are you looking for more specific information about like how much do these trades make, or just like?
I'm just wondering if you just go to community college. My question is, if you just go to community college, if you're wanting to go into environmental and you want to go into construction and water science and those things, is that enough to get a good paying job in the government, to just have that 2-year degree in those fields if they're going into environmental?
Got it. Okay. I think that it depends, because there's so many different types of jobs you can do if you're interested in environmental issues. So there's people who go out and do surveys of air quality, water quality. if you want to be like a designer or an architect, you might need a 4-year degree. But I guess what I can speak to just from my experience at the county is really those construction jobs. Oftentimes you don't even need any degree. You can go straight out onto the job site, and like the organization that I work on, part of what we do is free education. So we're like every week we have multiple webinars, in-person training, these certifications that I mentioned. So I think for someone who's maybe interested in construction especially, that's a pathway where you can really quickly start making money, but you can also distinguish yourself as a contractor who understands how to create green buildings and market yourself in that space and take advantage of like all the rebates that are available.
We have another question here.
If trees breathe carbon dioxide, then why aren't our carbon emissions good for the environment?
I think so some emissions happen naturally, right? It's like part of the system. The issue now is just that we have too many emissions. So we're seeing the consequences of that. But emissions on their own are not bad. Carbon on its own is not bad. It's a natural process. But the issue is we're just out of whack.
So I know like a lot of like EV chargers are powered by like diesel generators. Like, what do you think we could do to like change that? Or like, do you think we should like just stick to diesel and like gas? So like, if they're just producing the same amount of emissions to like charge an EV, like why not just stay with like a gas or diesel engine?
So here in Ventura County and also in Los Angeles County, we have the Clean Power Alliance. And basically what this is, it's like the utilities, but they build clean energy instead of, for example, gas power plants, or you mentioned diesel, but usually it's natural gas. With the Clean Power Alliance, they build solar, they build wind, they build batteries, and ultimately these systems are cleaner. They don't produce emissions. They, in the long run, will be they'll be cheaper, because with fossil fuels, you have to keep generating the inputs. So natural gas will get expensive because we have less and less of it. So with Clean Power Alliance, we're building resources that are going to be cheaper for us, and then it's clean energy that powers our grid. So when you go to charge your electric car, it's actually being powered by clean energy, not by diesel.
Thank you. There's another question.
Could you elaborate more on like your year abroad and what you did in Costa Rica?
Sure. So in Costa Rica, the program was focused on language, learning Spanish, and then it was also focused on the environment. So there was someone who donated a piece of land to Pitzer College, and it was used for raising cows. It was a cattle ranch, and it had been used that way for many years. And I'm not sure why the cattle ranch was no longer in place, but they had this land and they wanted to restore it back to more of its natural state. And so what we did was we worked on basically restoration work. So we wanted to restore this piece of land to rainforest. So what we did was we worked on planting different native plants and trying to bring back all of the biodiversity. So bring back the plants that the ecosystem needs. And so a lot of what we did was more of like environmental science. You know, what I work on now is environmental policy and environmental programs, but that was really the science of learning, you know, what does an ecosystem need to thrive? And when you've disrupted the ecosystem so much, how do you bring it back into its natural state? We also did some like bamboo harvesting, so I think there was interest also in not just restoring it to rainforest, but figuring out how they could also make some money from it too.
Can you hear me? Okay. So my question is, how, like on the topic of EVs and batteries, like lithium batteries, how are they more renewable than just using a gas engine when you have to mine cobalt, lithium, and including that there's a lot of like child labor involved in South America and Africa? Like, I just don't understand how electricity can be a safer alternative when you have to go through a lot more mining and emissions to get to the material itself.
Yeah. Yeah, right? Like lots of controversy around batteries, and it's not just one side trying to discredit the other. Like these are very real issues. The issue is climate change versus with mining, you have environmental contamination, there's human rights issues, but they are a little bit of separate issues, right? So with climate change, the way that we solve climate change is by bringing our emissions down. And the way that we bring our emissions down is with clean energy and then storing that clean energy in batteries. So when you produce batteries through the mining, if you are creating environmental contamination, that's not necessarily creating emissions. So yes, there are environmental issues with batteries, and I'm not definitely, I feel like just the space that I work in, you know, saying that I'm a sustainability professional, it doesn't mean that I feel good about everything that's happening with batteries. I think we need batteries, but I'm also disturbed by the issues with batteries. But climate change is, you know, the emissions that are driving all the warming and all the changing of the climate is different from, let's say, the contamination of the water that happens from mining. Does that nuance make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have to address those issues for sure. Yeah, we'll have to work on that.
Other questions?
My question is, when do you think like human rights should be more of a priority over climate change? Like the kids in the mines and stuff.
So I don't work on batteries myself, so I haven't like delved too deeply into this space, but I think that human rights should always be a priority. I don't think it should be environment or people. So if I were running an electric vehicle company, I would make sure that my supply chain is really solid and that I know what's happening in the mines and that I'm only working with mines that have good human rights policies. So I don't think it needs to be an either or, but I do think that it requires putting a lot of pressure onto the people who are in those, in the positions to make those decisions. So, you know, people talk about like there's a lot of power in where you put your money. So the people who are purchasing these batteries and are purchasing the inputs for the batteries, they are the ones who ultimately are the ones who decide, you know, what kind of operations they're running. But I think all of us who consume these products can put a lot of pressure on them too.
I think this is on. Oh. Hi, I'm Anna Walsh. I moderate the Environmental Club, and it was actually some seniors from our club who reached out to Mr. Bunce about bringing in someone who's in the sustainability field. So thank you so much for coming to and talking about the pathways and addressing all these really tough, valid questions that kids have, because it's very complicated. I just had two other questions. The Environmental Club this year has really been focusing on composting, getting our school composting. So if you wouldn't mind just speaking on the importance of composting, what that has to do with climate change, just as an expert in the field. And then secondly, what can students do now, even when they're in high school, to start kind of moving towards a pathway in sustainability? Are there internships or other things they can do during the summer, even before college? Okay, thank you.
So on compost, I'm definitely not a compost expert, but I can speak a little bit to it. Yeah, my career has definitely gone down this path of energy, but I have been more interested in soil and this like movement for regenerative agriculture, because what we are learning is if you improve your soil quality through composting and bringing in all of the nutrients that we need into our compost, then the soil can actually sequester a lot of carbon. So then we can be less reliant on other things. And And agriculture is a big source of our emissions. But this move towards regenerative agriculture is all about improving the soil quality, and then the soil will actually sequester the carbon. And it also can retain a lot more water. Compost soil that is rich with compost can retain, I don't remember the stats, but basically you don't have to water as much because it will hang on to the water instead of it just running off. And then, of course, compost reduces our reliance on all of these commercial fertilizers. The commercial fertilizers also require a lot of energy to generate them. And then you deal with a lot of these issues of like runoff and water contamination, because if the soil isn't healthy, then it can't actually absorb all that it needs from all these commercial fertilizers that we put on them, versus a natural compost. The soil is able to just more naturally absorb what it needs. And then you asked about, how can people get started now? So the program that I mentioned that I work on, 3C Ren, we have, as I mentioned, free trainings all the time. So just doing some education, I think, is one way that people can get started. There are internships. I think that our internship with the county is opening up this month. And then there's also a lot of great firms doing environmental work in Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. So working, for example, for an architecture firm that does green work. There are a lot of firms locally that I've been able to connect with through my work at the county, and I'm happy to share more specific names if people let me know kind of what they're interested in. But yes, I think internships are a great idea, but also just doing your own education on what speaks to you.
So a question, just if there are students that are interested in internships, can we communicate with you about where you might suggest? I can have them come into my office or connect them with you via email so that they could move forward with that.
Yeah, the county has a high school intern program, and then I can also connect you with some of the other firms that I work with.
That sounds great. Thank you.